The spit landed on Marcus Deal's chest before he'd finished speaking. Clean shot. Right on the Deal Automotive patch stitched above his left pocket, the patch he'd made the week he opened the place, back when he still ran everything himself. Marcus looked down at his uniform. Then, up at the young man standing 3 feet away, hand still raised from the gesture, lip curled. Around them, 4 other customers in the waiting area had gone completely still. The parts counter attendant had stopped typing. 2 mechanics had walked out of the service bay. Nobody said anything. The young man's name was Preston Aldgate. 24 years old. A Rolex on each wrist, 1 gold, 1 platinum, and the particular expression of someone who had never once faced a consequence he didn't buy his way out of. What Preston Aldgate did not know, standing in that service bay with his chest forward and his chin up, was that the man he just spat on owned 6 of these garages, and that his father, a man who had built a $2 billion construction empire on the back of people who actually showed up and actually worked, was going to hear about every second of this before dinner. Rewind 18 months. This is where the story. Marcus Deal was 46 years old when Preston Aldgate walked into the West Side location of Deal Automotive and decided that his 40 minutes of waiting entitled him to behave like a man who had never been told no. But Marcus hadn't been waiting. Marcus had been working since 5 in the morning, same as every day that ended in a number. He had opened his first garage at 31, in a rented bay behind a tire shop on Clement Street. 2 lifts, 1 diagnostic computer, 3 employees including himself. He'd spent his 20s as a master technician at a regional dealership chain, working every certification the industry offered, studying shop management on nights and weekends. Saving money with the discipline of a man who could see exactly where he was going and refused to let the distance between him and it become an excuse. The rented bay became a standalone building after 3 years. The standalone building became 2 locations after 5. By the time Marcus was 46, Deal Automotive had 6 locations across the city, 41 full-time employees, a fleet maintenance contract with the county, and a reputation that brought customers across neighborhood lines in a city where neighborhood lines generally held. He was not a quiet success. He was a deliberate one, the kind built on margins and relationships, and the radical conviction that if you treated people right, they came back and they brought other people with them. His waiting areas had coffee that wasn't terrible. His service advisors were trained to explain the work to customers who wanted to understand it. His technicians were paid above market rate, which meant his turnover was low, which meant his quality was consistent, which meant his reputation compounded year after year. He had started at the West Side location that morning, as he did most Tuesdays, because the service manager there, a man named Darnell, who had been with him since the 2nd location, ran a clean operation but appreciated a set of extra eyes on the floor during the morning rush. Marcus wore his uniform every day he was on site. Some owners didn't bother once they had people to do the work. Marcus thought that was exactly the kind of thinking that got you into trouble. The moment you stopped being someone who could do the thing was the moment you stopped being able to lead the people who did. He was finishing a write-up at the service counter at 9:47 a.m. when the arguments started. It had been brewing for about 20 minutes. Preston Aldgate had brought in a black Porsche Taycan Turbo S, current year, 48-hour-old dealer plates, with a complaint about a vibration in the steering column at highway speeds. The service advisor, a young woman named Keisha, had taken the car in, run the initial and told Preston the vehicle would need approximately 90 minutes for a full road test and inspection. Preston had asked why it couldn't be done faster. Keisha had explained. Preston had asked again. Keisha had explained again, in the careful tone of someone who has made this explanation before, and knows that making it a third time will not change anything. Preston Aldgate had sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes, which was 50 minutes less than the time he'd been told, before he walked up to the service counter and told Keisha she was incompetent. Not that the service was slow, not that he was frustrated with the timeline, that she, specifically, was incompetent. And he said it loudly enough that the other 4 customers in the waiting area heard every syllable. Keisha had been at Deal Automotive for 3 years. She held a service advisor certification and a degree in automotive technology. She had never, in Marcus's recollection, received a complaint from a customer about the quality of her communication. Her retention numbers, the measure of how many customers she personally converted to repeat visits, were the best in the West Side location and second best in the company. Marcus came around the counter. He introduced himself, said he was the owner, said he'd heard the exchange and wanted to address it, said it calmly, without aggression, the way a man addresses something that needs addressing. Preston Aldgate looked him up and down. His eyes moved across the uniform, the grease stains from the early morning, the Deal Automotive patch on the chest, the work boots that had seen real use. He looked at Marcus the way certain people look at things they've decided don't require their full attention. He said, "Then you should hire people who know what they're doing." Marcus said Keisha knew exactly what she was doing, and that the timeline she'd given him was accurate, and that the car would be ready when it was ready. Preston said he'd been waiting 40 minutes for a simple vibration check, and that if Marcus couldn't run a shop that served customers properly, maybe he should consider what kind of business he was actually qualified to run. Marcus looked at him steadily for a moment. Then, he said, "Sir, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice." That was when Preston Aldgate spat. The waiting room went silent the way rooms go silent when something happens that can't be walked back. Marcus stood still for 3 full seconds. He looked down at his uniform. He looked up at Preston. He was very, very calm. The kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the complete mastery of it. The kind you develop when you've spent 20 years running a business in spaces where some people will always decide you are there to serve them in ways that have nothing to do with the service. He said, "You need to leave." Preston said he wasn't going anywhere until his car was finished, and that Marcus ought to think carefully about who he was talking to. The waiting room had not moved. The parts counter attendant had turned fully around. Both mechanics from the service bay were standing in the doorway, watching without a word, the way people watch something that requires a witness. Marcus took 1 step forward, not aggressive, deliberate. The step of a man who has worked 20 years in spaces where certain people decide, without looking closely enough, that they have the advantage. He said, "I know exactly who I'm talking to." He said it without heat, and without flinching, and without the smallest trace of apology in it. "The vehicle will be returned to you, at no charge. The keys will be at the front desk in 30 minutes. And from this morning forward, you are not welcome at this location, or any Deal Automotive location in this city." Preston stared at him. Marcus held the look with the particular stillness of a man who has built something and knows the precise weight of it. Preston said his father would hear about this. He said it the way certain people say things they intend as threats, with the confidence that the name behind the threat is large enough to change the geography of the room. Marcus said, "That's fine. I'd like to speak with him." Something shifted in Preston's face. Not regret, not yet, possibly not ever, but a small recalculation. He had expected the threat. He had expected the room to change around him the way rooms had always changed around him when he deployed that name. It had not changed. The mechanics in the doorway were still there. Keisha's hands were still flat on the counter. Marcus was still looking at him with the same expression he'd had from the moment he came around that counter. The expression of a man who had already decided how this ended and was simply waiting for the other party to figure it out. Preston left. Not calmly, he knocked a standing display off the counter on his way to the door. The kind of small violence that announces injury to no one in particular, and he pulled the Taycan out of the lot with the acceleration of a man who needs an engine to finish his point for him. The sound faded. The lot went quiet. For a moment the waiting room held the particular silence that follows something no one quite has words for yet. Then someone in the far corner of the waiting area, an older man in a work shirt, waiting on an oil change, said quietly to no one, "Well." And somehow that was exactly right. Darnell crossed from the service bay doorway and looked at Marcus. He'd been with Marcus since the second location. He'd seen him lose accounts and win them back. He'd seen him negotiate with a building inspector who'd failed the third location on a technicality and come away with a certificate anyway. He'd seen Marcus deal in a lot of difficult. He would later tell the other location managers that what struck him most about that morning was how quiet Marcus had gotten in the moment of it. Not cold, not performed. The actual quiet of a man who knew who he was in the room and didn't need the room to confirm it. The waiting room exhaled. Keisha was at the service counter with her hands flat on the surface, not shaking, but clearly working at not shaking, which was a different thing and harder. Marcus came around the counter and stood beside her and said quietly that she had handled herself with more professionalism than the situation deserved or required, and that he'd seen it, and that every person in that waiting room had seen it. She nodded once. She didn't trust her voice yet, and she didn't pretend to. Marcus went to the back office. He sat down at the desk that still had the photograph of his first rented bay pinned to the corkboard above it. The rented bay on Clement Street. The two lifts. The young man in the fresh uniform with his arms crossed, and he sat with his hands folded for a moment before he did anything else. 15 years ago, standing in that rented bay at 31 years old, Marcus had made a decision about the kind of business he was going to build and the kind of man he was going to be building it. He had decided he was going to build something that compounded, not just financially, but in terms of what it represented. A standard. A place where every employee understood that the name above the door meant something specific about how people were treated, and every customer understood the same. You didn't build that in a single morning. You built it 10,000 mornings in a row, and sometimes a morning like this one arrived to test whether the architecture held. He believed it had held. He picked up his phone and made a call. Not to a lawyer. Not to the police. To Raymond Aldgate. Because Marcus Deal had known Raymond Aldgate for 11 years. And because Raymond Aldgate was, in a real and documented sense, the reason Deal Automotive had 6 locations instead of 3. The history was not complicated, but it was significant. 8 years prior, Marcus had been running 3 locations and actively scouting sites for a 4th when his operating capital ran short of what the bank would finance. He had the track record. He had the revenue. He had the kind of numbers that should have made any commercial lender comfortable. But commercial lenders in this city had a way of looking at those numbers through a particular lens when the operator was a 40-year-old black man from the west side of the city. And what came back from 2 banks was not the loan. It was a smaller loan he could appeal. Or no loan at all. He'd been introduced to Raymond Aldgate through a mutual contact in commercial real estate. A property manager named Gus, who had leased Marcus his first 2 storefronts and believed, as he told Marcus directly, that Marcus was building something worth backing properly. Raymond had a quiet reputation for equity investments in small businesses, with strong track records and operators who understood their business better than any investor ever would. He asked for a minority stake and long-term patience, not interest, and a payoff schedule. For Marcus, it was the right structure. They'd met once before the agreement, a 2.5-hour meeting in Raymond Aldgate's corner office on the 14th floor of a building Raymond owned, with a view of the skyline and a desk that cost more than Marcus's first bay equipment. Raymond had asked about operations, margins, technician retention, customer acquisition costs, and then had asked Marcus what he thought his biggest mistake had been in the first 3 years. Marcus had told him directly and specifically, and Raymond had nodded and not commented further. They shook hands at the end of a conversation that neither of them had expected to like as much as they did. Over 8 years, the relationship had become something beyond professional. Raymond showed up to quarterly reviews having actually read the materials. He asked useful questions. He did not try to run the business, he'd been explicit about that, but he was attentive in the way that serious investors are attentive, which meant he noticed things and mentioned them and trusted Marcus to decide what to do with them. He had mentioned his son exactly once, using the word challenge, and moved past it with the efficiency of a man who had made peace with certain things by not giving them room to expand. Marcus dialed Raymond's cell, not his assistant, not the main office line, the cell, because this was not a business call in the usual sense. Raymond answered on the second ring. Marcus told him what had happened, all of it, in the order it occurred. He read from the security camera log that Darnell had already pulled, timestamps, observable actions, the exact phrases he could recall with certainty. He did not editorialize. He did not lean on the details that were most damaging. He gave Raymond the full account and let it sit. Raymond Aldgate was silent for 14 seconds after Marcus finished. 14 seconds on a phone call with a man you know well is a very different silence from 14 seconds with a stranger. It is not dead air. It is someone doing something. In this case, it was a man calculating, not whether what Marcus had described was true. Because he had known Marcus for 8 years and had no doubt of that, but what it meant and what it required. Then Raymond said, "Don't touch the footage." Marcus said he had no intention of touching it. Raymond said he'd call back within the hour. He called back in 22 minutes. He was coming to the West Side location. That afternoon, he wanted to review the footage himself, speak with Keisha directly. And there was something else, he said it plainly. Without softening it, this was not the first incident involving Preston. And it was going to stop. Raymond Aldgate arrived at 2:30 p.m. in a car that cost more than the average Deal Automotive customer's annual salary. He walked in without ceremony, shook Marcus's hand, nodded to Darnell, and asked to be taken to the back office. He watched the security footage twice, without speaking. Then he asked to meet Keisha. She came in composed, the way professionals come into rooms where their experience is being discussed, upright, prepared, not performing anything. Raymond Aldgate shook her hand. He told her that what had happened to her was unacceptable by any standard of human decency, and that the person responsible had not been raised to behave that way, and that his embarrassment about the fact that he had was not her concern, but he wanted her to know it was real. Keisha said she appreciated that. Raymond asked if she had anything she wanted to say about how the matter should be addressed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she wanted to keep doing her job well, and she wanted her customers to trust that what had happened that morning was not a reflection of the standard Marcus set for his business or the standard she held herself to. Raymond nodded slowly. He turned to Marcus and said, She's very good. Marcus said he knew. Raymond left the office and called his son. The details of that conversation were not shared with Marcus, and he did not ask. What he knew was the outcome, and the outcome arrived in the form of Preston Aldgate walking through the West Side location door at 9:15 the following morning. No Rolex visible, plain jacket. He was alone. He asked for Keisha. She came to the counter. Preston Aldgate stood in the waiting room of a garage he had dismissed the previous day, with the expression of a young man who had spent the night finding out what the things he'd said actually cost. He apologized. He did it looking at her, not at the floor. He said what he'd done was wrong and indefensible. He didn't explain it. He didn't contextualize it. He said he was sorry, and that he understood if the apology meant nothing. Keisha said she appreciated him coming back. She said it professionally, without warmth she didn't feel, and without cruelty she wasn't going to give. Preston nodded. He left. Darnell watched him go from the service bay entrance and then looked at Marcus, who was standing at the parts counter with his coffee going cold. "You think that was real?" Darnell said. Marcus considered the question. "I think his father made him come. What he does with it after is his own business." 3 weeks after that morning, Raymond Aldgate requested a meeting with Marcus. They sat in the back office at the West Side location, same desk, same photograph of the first rented bay, and Raymond told Marcus he intended to increase his stake in Deal Automotive. He wanted to fund a 7th location. He had a site in mind in the eastern part of the county. Underserved, high-foot traffic, no quality independent shop within 4 miles. He put a number on the table that would cover the build-out entirely and leave Marcus with capital to staff the opening properly. Marcus looked at the number. He looked at Raymond. He said, "This isn't about what Preston did." Raymond said, "No, it's about what you've built. What happened last week just reminded me I hadn't looked at it carefully enough lately." He paused. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the rented bay, the 2 lifts, the young man in the uniform standing in front of it with his arms crossed and something in his posture that was already, even then, entirely sure of where he was going. "My son looked at that uniform," Raymond said quietly, "and thought it told him who you were. He was wrong. I want to make sure I never make the same mistake twice." Marcus signed the agreement 2 weeks later. The 7th location opened the following spring. On the day of the opening, ribbon cutting, neighborhood food trucks in the lot, a line of customers who had been waiting for a decent shop in that part of the county for years. Marcus wore his uniform. The Deal Automotive patch was on the chest, fresh stitched on a new set, and on the inside collar of the jacket he'd had a date embroidered in small letters, the date of the morning Preston Aldgate had spat on him in the waiting room. Not to remember the wound. To remember the standard. The stillness he'd held in that moment. The complete mastery of the thing was the same thing that had built 6 locations and would build a 7th and an 8th after that. The uniform wasn't just a uniform. It was the whole argument. Everything he was, and everything he'd built, stitched above a left pocket, earned across 20 years of showing up. Raymond Aldgate attended the opening. He stood in the parking lot with a cup of coffee that wasn't terrible and watched the first customers pull in, and he looked the way men look when they've put money in the right place and know it. Preston Aldgate did not attend. No one had expected him to. What happened with Preston after that Tuesday? Whether the lesson held, whether he found his way to something better, whether the apology to Keisha was the beginning of a change or just a performance arranged by his father, was not Marcus's story to tell or follow. Marcus's story was here. The new lift going up in Bay 3. Darnell on the phone with a fleet account. The smell of clean concrete and machine oil in a building that, as of this morning, had his name above the door for the 7th time. He finished his coffee. He went to work.